Hello, everyone. Welcome to Fired Up, the podcast for marketers working in early and late stage startups. I'm Morgan McClintock, the CEO of startup marketing agency Firebrand. We've launched this podcast to interview the best in the business, but I'm not going to do it alone. So please meet my co-hosts.
I'm Nicole Pytel, Firebrand's VP of Content Marketing.
And I'm Chris Ulbrich, Firebrand's Head of Media Relations.
I'm Ian Lipner, a tech PR and crisis communications veteran.
We'll drop a new episode each week, so there's plenty of fuel for your marketing fire. Get the spark you need to take your startup to a whole new level. Hello there, and welcome to Fired Up. My name is Morgan McClintock, and today I'm joined by Chris Ulbrich. Hey, Chris, how are you?
I'm doing great.
So we are going to talk about how to pitch a media exclusive. And this is one of our burning questions that we get a lot. So Chris has joined me to go through the whole process. What is an exclusive? What goes into it? How do you decide if you should pitch an exclusive or go broader? We're really going to unpack all of that. Before we get into it, last week we talked about the fact that we had launched our newsletter, The Forge, on LinkedIn. So bring your newsletter to where the audience is. And we got 100 signups on the first day, which is really good. And just as a quick sort of data point, I just checked a week later, we've got 200. So for other startups out there, if you're thinking about using this tactic, whatever you get on the first day, you might also get that same again a week later. So I think definitely a tactic worth looking into. And we had launched with a really strong piece of content around account-based PR. We've had a lot of questions about that. But just a shout out to a new piece of content for those interested for our PR audience. We've launched a guide for startups, how to measure PR. Again, a big question that we get. There's a lot of great information out there. We had on this very show, Richard Bagnall from Amex, who's probably the foremost authority on PR measurement. Go check out that episode. But what we've done here, it's an ungated asset. You can just download it, but sort of pull together all the research, all the best research, a bit of history on PR measurement and how it applies to startups, because you can easily read the best practices that they mainly apply to large organizations with lots of coverage and lots of signal. But when you come down for a smaller organization at the early stages of its PR program, you're looking at smaller bits of signal. So how should you measure it? Do we want to do share of voice? We've got an opinion on that. How do you actually know that you're doing a good job, especially when other organizations are later in their PR investment? They might be investing more. So if you're doing a share of voice against them, how do you provide some context? And often the context takes a lot more explaining than the actual signal that you get from the measurement. So how do you navigate that? So we've done some thinking there. You can put it all into a nice guide. Please go onto the site, firebrand.marketing, and download that. But today, we're going to talk about when to pitch a media exclusive. And we get this a lot. We just worked on a great one, media exclusive with MIT Tech Review for a product launch. So you can do it for product launches. You can do it for funding. You can do it for lots of types of announcements. But what goes into that decision making? So, Chris, let's just walk through this. When we're talking about pitching a media exclusive, let's just start. What is a media exclusive?
So an exclusive is an agreement with a reporter that reporter and that publication will get the news in question before anyone else. Will not only get it, but have the right to publish it before anyone else. So typically it takes the form of an agreement that the news will come out at a particular time, and both sides understand that whatever constitutes the exclusive will be solely in the hands of this one publication until that moment that both agree.
So how is that different from an embargo, which also those two often get confused?
And it's interesting because reporters will sometimes talk about embargoes, and fair enough, but they'll talk about embargoes in the context of an exclusive. So an embargo is a sort of a broader form of the agreement, or you could think of an exclusive as a subset of an embargo. But an embargo is an agreement between a news maker and a news publisher, that the news will not be published before a certain time, right? So the news publisher receives the news ahead of time, but agrees not to print it, not to publish it in any way until the designated time there. Now, unlike an exclusive, it's possible to pitch multiple reporters, what's called under embargo. So multiple reporters will have the story, but they all agree not to hold it until the same time. It differs from the exclusive in the number of people involved. And we'll probably get into this more, but for practical purposes, it differs because there's actually less flexibility when you're working on with an embargo, because you have an agreement with multiple people. And in order to change the terms of that agreement, if you're playing fair, as we always aim to do, you would need to clear any change with all the people in the embargo, and that can get very tricky. So you try to avoid that if at all possible. Once you start pitching under embargo, most of the time, once you have people signed up for the embargo, then you're kind of locked in. With an exclusive, you have more flexibility because you're working with one publication, and assuming that you're okay shifting to meet their needs, then there's no foul, no harm to make any changes in flight that you need to.
Right. Which normally around the timing, because you're launching a product and the product slips, or you're announcing funding and there's a new investor that comes in at the end, or, there's some coordination that's done.
Exactly.
So almost all big news is pitched under an embargo, an agreement not to publish it until a certain time, so that the reporters can all get their pieces written and you can get the information out there. But a subset of those are going to be exclusive, where it's only to one single reporter. And on the day, there's one article that comes out, hopefully in detail, about that news. So just walk through the actual mechanical process. We've decided we're going to do an exclusive, and I want to go into how we make that decision. But we've decided to do an exclusive. What's the process?
Well, in some ways, it's really straightforward. Ahead of time, you will have, or your PR representation will have made a list of desired publications that we all agree would be good fits for an exclusive where one publication gets the news ahead of time. And you basically prioritize that list and you approach the reporters one at a time. The form of that outreach will depend on the reporter, the type of publication, whether you're talking about breaking news people who don't have a minute to spare, or whether you are old friends with a reporter going back 10 years and you've worked with them a bunch of times and they're always happy to hear from you. It depends on lots of factors. But one of the attractions of an exclusive is that when it goes smoothly, it's really simple. You're working with one reporter. You are trying to figure out what will make this a worthwhile story just for them. Often, if you've engaged a reporter with enough of a time buffer, you have some flexibility to shape the story to their needs. They'll come back and say, yeah, well, this could be good for us, but we would really need to get your investor involved. Like, for this to be a story for us, we'd really need to hear from your investor, or we'd really need to hear from a customer. And then if you haven't lined that up already, and ideally you will have done this in the planning phase, but if anything is needed for the exclusive that you haven't lined up, you often have the luxury of time and of only needing to satisfy one person to figure out what you need to go back and get to seal the deal, to close the sale, so to speak. The process itself is fairly simple. It's actually the decision making about whether this is the right process that can get fairly involved.
All right. Well, let's talk about that. What kinds of stories would typically be pitched under an exclusive for a startup? And then secondarily, how do I decide whether I should go for an exclusive or pitch it to a broader number of reporters under an embargo? It's still an important story for us, but we're going after multiple outlets?
This is one of the main questions that the PR representation will deal with for any announcement. It's one of the first things you'll think about when you have news to announce, whether it makes sense as an exclusive or to pitch it more broadly under embargo. For startups, it's only the news for which you have the lowest expectations of coverage that you would even think to just issue the news on the day and hope for coverage. Because with the relatively constrained media landscape today, with reporters trying to get across all sorts of news from companies big and small, it's very rare that desirable coverage will be available on the day, because reporters basically are booked out for weeks. Sometimes I've seen cases where they book out 6 weeks in advance. So you're going to be pre-pitching one way or another. And pre-pitching just simply means providing the news under embargo or as an exclusive. You're going to be pre-pitching almost every announcement. It's just a question of whether you're giving it to one reporter or trying to give it to one reporter or many. There are a lot of factors that influence that. I think the main one is you have to consider the quality of your news. Is this news substantial enough to support a lengthy, in-depth story? And then is there what you might think of as a market for that story? And from the reporter's point of view, an exclusive is always, it's at least neutral and usually at least a small plus because they have a story that nobody else has. Now, we have this idea, I think in popular culture, that reporters are these insatiable, scoop-hungry creatures who exist to break news that nobody else has. And I do think that most reporters, given the choice, would work that way. But a lot of, especially trade journalism, is not really that scoop driven. It is relatively quickly produced and it is not terribly in depth. So from the reporter's point of view, they're trying to get through 3 stories today and any given day, right? The reporter who's trying to do that may not have a lot of incentives to get the story ahead of time. And if you have the kind of news that is mostly trade oriented, it's for an audience that might be publishing a week after, often with trades, stories will come out week, 2 weeks, sometimes even a month after news publishes. And they're not that worried about being the first to get it because by the time they publish, it's been out for a while, right? If that is the universe of contacts for a given announcement, it probably doesn't make sense to offer it as an exclusive because you're just limiting the potential number of clips you can get. Because the downside of an exclusive is that if someone gets the news first, then for everybody else, it's at best neutral and at least a negative, or at least a mild negative, right? And often it's a serious negative. For anything from TechCrunch, I would say, meaning business publications, Bloomberg, CNBC, up to the mainstream publications. If another publication has the news first, it's practically disqualifying to pitch the exact same story to someone else. The trade-off that you are generally making with an exclusive versus an embargo is with the exclusive, you can be pretty sure you're going to get that coverage that you've arranged with the reporter. Your chance of follow-on coverage is greatly reduced. Whereas with an embargo, you have multiple reporters lined up, but the value of that story for each of the reporters is lower because they know other people are publishing it. So they may flake, they may drop out, they may just stop communicating with you. So you basically are trading the chance of more people covering for less security about who is going to cover, what the story is going to look like. Whereas with the exclusive, you are hoping, the aim is to get more in-depth coverage and the ability to shape the story more carefully by working with a single reporter.
And the kinds of news that this would fall under is often funding. It can be product news if it's a truly sort of groundbreaking development. It can be research. Hey, we're giving you this great research exclusively so that because you really want a particular outlet to cover it in detail. And obviously with research, there's a lot of angles there. It can be M&A. It can be any number of announcements that you want. But it has to kind of reach that ledge, as you said. Like, this has to be something that it's going to have an audience of like, obviously we, as the startup, we want that story to be as detailed as possible because there's an endless amount of fascinating things about our company that we like. We work here. But are there lots of readers that are going to also follow this brand or this particular topic, therefore creating a big audience for the reporter to warrant their time really writing a lot of detail about this particular story? So that's the sort of the type of story that you have. And then should we pitch it as an exclusive? As you said, has to come down to what is the story, right? But then have we got a particular reporter who can write this accurately? What are our competitors doing? I mean, if this story has been out a lot, we're launching the third of these products, in this particular space, we're catching up. You might think, okay, maybe we should go fairly broad with this because it's not, or you might decide, actually, we'll try and find someone who actually is following our company trajectory and can write about it because it matters to that, it matters to them. And really the audience for the number of reporters who are going to cover this otherwise could be small. So you might use the fact that this is an exclusive to sort of add an extra point to the value to the reporter of this story. And of course, sort of prior coverage, like what are your competitors doing? If they're pitching exclusives with a particular publication, maybe you want to go with somebody else because they've already got their piece in TechCrunch in your space. And if they write about you, they're going to mention your competitor and you may or may not want that.
That's exactly right.
Talk to me a bit about timing. So you had said, look, some reporters are booked up 4 weeks, 6 weeks in advance. In the simplest version of this, you get your materials together, we package our story up, we reach out to one reporter and say, hey, do you want this? And they say yes, and it's done. And then it's just a question of them doing the interview and getting the materials and writing the story. What should we be thinking about in an ideal world, timing-wise, when we're thinking about a major announcement like this?
One of the more counterintuitive aspects of pitching an exclusive is that you often need to leave more time when you're taking this approach than you do when you're pitching an embargo. You might think, well, if you're only pitching one person, I can do this on a shorter timeline than I can with an embargo. But it's often the other way around. And the reason for that relates to something that you said earlier, which was that it is possible that you are pitching the the exclusive, because it is possible that that is the one way you're going to get coverage of the announcement. Typically, the two kinds of exclusive that you're pitching are when you have news that's so good, you think it supports a deep and detailed story that helps move your entire narrative in the press forward. But the other fairly common scenario is when you have a story that's right on the edge of newsworthiness, and it could go either way, and you're hoping with an exclusive to push it over the top. Or another version of that is you're hoping for a detailed story, but you think that the news might just barely support it. So rather than getting multiple reporters to cover it in a sort of commodity fashion, lightly rewriting the press release with maybe a custom quote added, what you're aiming for is some, really rich piece, but you are 50-50 whether you're going to be able to get that. So then you offer it as an exclusive to try to push it over the top. Now, when you do that, it may work, but it may not work. If you have only left yourself a short period of time to pitch the story, by the time you realize that the exclusive strategy isn't going to get the job done, it might even be too late to pre-pitch it. And you find yourself with essentially nothing, except what you can get from pitching on the day. And as we said earlier, that is a strategy that does not tend to yield great results. So what you will often do is, if you're taking an exclusive strategy, you actually extend the timeline a bit. For total period of pitching time, you might look at 3 weeks to 4 weeks to give yourself enough time to fully explore the exclusive opportunity. And if that doesn't pan out, you have sufficient time, at least a week, to pitch it under embargo. In the end, if you are pursuing an exclusive, it's important, unless you have previously established interest from a reporter who's just saying, hey, when this news comes out, look me up, give me the exclusive, and we'll run with this. If that's the case, you generally don't need to leave as much time. Although even there, the reporter might have said that to you 6 months ago, but things might have changed. In the meantime, better to be safe and sorry if you possibly can. Establish that contact early on. Leave yourself enough time so that you have room to make adjustments to the strategy if needed.
Right. Because mechanically, here's our list of reporters, and we think in order we think would like to write the story, and we'd like to have them cover it. The first one, you might pitch them, they might not be interested. The next one's on vacation. The next one is hosting a show and is leading a panel at their conference. And the next one's got COVID. For each of these, you need 24, 48 hours to sort of, hey, are you interested in this? No, go. You might not hear back because they're busy on assignment. You've got to leave it some time before you sort of go, okay, that one's not a fit, or before they get a chance to reply, before you move on. And so it's very easy to eat up a week with 2 or 3 of those. One of them's in the UK, so that adds a time difference, which can play in your advantage sometimes, but also can slow things down. So it's always a bit of a journey with an exclusive to find someone. Sometimes it can be one and done, hurrah. But sometimes you've got to knock on a few different doors and you've got to hold your nerve. But you do come up to that point where, okay, my list is getting shorter. These other people would love to do it, but for a variety of reasons can't. Maybe one of them agreed to do it, but then fell ill. Then you're into, okay, the exclusive strategy is not going to work. We're not going to be able to pull it off. So we need to kind of go broader. So build in some time to give yourself some contingency. You can hope for the best, but plan for that. And I think for a lot of startups, it makes perfect sense when you start thinking about it mechanically. But when you're trying to launch your product, or you're trying, your funding is closed and you obviously want to get that out as soon as possible, you don't add on this extra time. Okay, this is going to take 4 weeks or 5, 6 weeks even, because we've got to write the press release, we've got to think of the story, et cetera, et cetera. Oh my goodness. This is a lot more time. But actually, in an ideal situation to get it right, you got to provide yourself 3 good weeks of media pitching.
That's right. And there are ways to compress the entire process. Pitching is just part of the preparation for any announcement, including an exclusive. And the sort of easy assumption, and in some ways the easiest workflow, but the easiest assumption is that all of the preparatory work is complete. The messaging, the press release, lining up your customer, lining up your partners, your VC, if the VC is participating. Ideally, all that work is done ahead of time, but to some extent, it can be completed during the pitch process. It's not ideal, but it can be done. And often you are working, maybe I should reframe it. You are rarely working under ideal conditions in a situation like this, especially startups, which tend to operate on shorter timelines and than large companies do, with a lot less lead time. And it's just part of the process to be building the plane as you fly it, right? I would never encourage a client to approach an announcement like that, especially the press release. The press release is less important for most announcements than if you're pursuing an exclusive, especially, than people often think. For the reporter to decide whether they want to take an exclusive or not, they don't really need, in most cases, the finished press release. What they need to understand is the heart of the story. If it's a data-based story, for instance, what are the key findings that they'll be able to put in their story, and what is the significance of those findings? They'll want to know what spokespeople might be available. They'll want to ideally have a sample quote to get an idea for what kind of opinion the spokespeople might be able to provide. What they're looking for is a sense for whether there are enough ingredients to make this a viable story. The press release is a vehicle for all that material, and it is the easiest, most effective way to deliver it. It makes you look the most buttoned up if you can just hand over the finished press release. But it is not absolutely essential. I would much rather be pitching a great story with no press release than a mediocre story with a finished press release. And by a great story, I mean one whose messaging is geared toward the reporter's needs and the needs of the reporter's publication. And we have a very clear idea how the story is going to appeal, rather than present the reporter with a generic press release that's supposed to be all things to all people and ask them to extrapolate from that what the story ought to be. It's not necessarily either or. You can give them the press release, and you usually do. You give them the press release, but then you present them with a tailored pitch, sort of your take on the story. But that just underlines how the press release, in a way, is, for the purposes of securing an exclusive, is superfluous. It's actually more important when you're pitching under embargo, because the nature of an embargo is such that because the reporter knows other people will be getting essentially the exact same material that others are getting, they're going to invest less time in it. They're going to be less inclined to take an interview. They're going to be less inclined to engage with you about the details. So typically, if you're pitching under embargo, a reporter will say, yeah, send me the news. I might cover it. And then you go back in the days leading up and knock, knock. Hey, are you planning to cover it? And sometimes they will tell you, and sometimes they'll say, I'll figure it out the day before or maybe after. So in that respect, the two are very different.
And one of the upsides of an exclusive is that you have a pretty good idea that on the day, you're going to get a great piece of coverage. Whereas with a broader embargo, just as you say, they've accepted the news. There's no obligation for the reporter to write. Whereas with the exclusive, because you've been working together and they've invested the time, you're going to know. So that's one of the upsides if you want to sort of de-risk. Hey, we've got the rest of our, it's a product launch. We've got the rest of our marketing programs going on the day, and we're going to get this great piece of coverage. That's the upside. But there are downsides. So let's just talk about what are the downsides of pitching a story as an exclusive.
Yeah, that's an interesting and important question. Because as you say, one of the great benefits of approaching an announcement as an exclusive is that you do get security out of it, relative security. I mean, any PR pro who's been in the business long enough will have, nightmare stories about, low percentage situations that go sideways in low percentage ways, right? So every PR has a story about an exclusive that didn't get published, right? It rarely happens, but it can happen, right? But you're minimizing the chance that things go sideways in that respect, that you're going to end up on the day with no coverage. You minimize that chance with an exclusive. The downside, as I mentioned earlier, is that you also minimize the chance with an exclusive of follow-on coverage, of multiple publications covering the news, because you're effectively starting with them. You're going from a cold start with most of the other publications. And as we've, been saying throughout this conversation, that is not a recipe for success in the best case. And if reporters see you've already given the news to somebody else, they might not take it personally, but it certainly doesn't help your cause. So that's one of the trade-offs that you have to consider when you're going through the decision tree about exclusive versus embargo. When you're thinking, if this publication was the only publication to cover this news, would that be a satisfactory result for us? And if the answer is no, then that doesn't mean that exclusive isn't the right option. It just means that your task is much harder, because it means what you're shooting for is an exclusive and follow-on coverage. And you're going to have to come up with a plan to get that. And if the exclusive, getting that coverage, is rolling a rock downhill, getting the follow-on is rolling it uphill. So you really have to have a good, well-developed plan for how you're going to do that. And that might look like some piece of the story that you haven't provided, or a follow-on piece of the story that will develop within the next week or two of the announcement that you can present as a development of the story that was announced a week ago. You can say, we have this follow-on coming up, and you could pitch that under embargo, conceivably. But in general, the big choice you have to make is assurance of one piece of coverage versus a chance of multiple pieces of coverage with less assurance of getting any one of them. The other risk that you need to consider, especially as a PR representative, is just how likely it is that the story that you've placed is going to tick all the boxes for the client that has effectively given their okay on the strategy. A story that sounds good in notionally, when you actually see it out there and you are sort of on the day at 5 a.m. Pacific time, coming to grips with the fact that, like, that was good, but there may not be anything else. In that moment, it can create a lot of anxiety. So that's a long way of saying, when you go with an exclusive, there's a lot riding on that one story. In some ways, again, as a PR pro, it takes a lot of the anxiety off with regard to logistics. You don't need to worry about managing a bunch of reporters under embargo. It's a lot easier to update, materials, because you're only working with one person. There's relatively little chance of different version control problems seeping into the process. So logistically, exclusives are a lot simpler. But because the expectations are higher, in some ways they create a lot more stress, not just for the PR organization, but the wider marketing organization, because often the entire company will be on pins and needles waiting for this story to come out. And it's sort of similar to the phenomenon of a stock dropping after posting great earnings. There can be a feeling of letdown when the story comes out, because the story in your head, it's the perfect story, whereas the story that prints is never perfect. You'll always wish that this had gotten in there, or they hadn't put it quite that way. And if there are multiple pieces of coverage, it can be a little easier for the organization to look at the results holistically and think, well, this particular piece of coverage got this bit right, but they left it, this other thing out. But this piece over here got that missing piece right, and they left something else out. And they can sort of see that collectively all the pieces of coverage kind of hit what they wanted to hit in the news. Whereas with the exclusive, it's basically all or nothing.
Right. And so to that point, the piece comes out, it's great. There are some things that I like to change about it, because obviously the reporter has interpreted the information and written it for their audience. It's not a marketing messaging. They're not a buyer. They are writing the story. What can I change about the article, and what can't I change?
Yeah, that is a large and popular question that we get. What I do with clients, especially if we're working with them for the first time before the first big announcement, is I run through this very question, because inevitably, and I know this having worked as a reporter myself, inevitably, you find that in order to say something in 800 to 1200 words, you create errors of omission, or you commit errors of omission. You have to paraphrase. You are simplifying for your audience. And in doing so, You might use terminology that an expert wouldn't recognize or might feel doesn't completely accurately represent what they see as the facts of the matter or the features of the product or the purpose of the product. And that sort of highlights a split between marketing and PR, whereas marketing is aimed at a buyer and PR is specifically aimed at an audience of buyers and non-buyers, generally speaking. If you're pitching to certain trades, then you can assume that the audience are buyers and you can adjust your messaging accordingly. But where you tend to run into this problem we're discussing here is when you're working with, say, more mainstream reporters who are trying to make this highly technical content comprehensible for a wider audience. So what I tell clients is that as a rule, reporters are generally horrified to find that they have committed an error of clear fact. And it's important to understand what an error of clear fact is, because this can be a point of difference between the people like tech executives and people more on the PR side and reporters. So for a reporter, an error of clear fact is they got a number wrong. They misspelled a name. They included a feature that is actually not in the product. What is not an error of fact is anything that regards interpretation of what a company is doing, what a product is for. So often where you find clients want a correction as soon as the news comes out is that they feel that the reporter hasn't exactly captured the target audience for the product, or they haven't quite captured all the nuances of the purpose of the product or the ways the product can be used. I'm using product news as an example here. But it's often where this creeps in because the client naturally is thinking about this the way they think about their marketing. And they're seeing this article come out and they're thinking, well, we would never represent our product like that. That's language we would never use. And the nature of working with media is that you give up some control. You give up all control, actually, of the language used. I would always be, happy to go back to a reporter on is clear errors of fact. What clients often want you to go back on are, I don't like this headline. Like that's a very common complaint, or I don't like the image used to illustrate the story. And those are changes that we really don't have any standing to go back to the reporter on. Again, unless somehow in the headline, there is a clear error of fact. And I would actually add to clear error of fact, something I call impact of error. So this is more of a tactical question for the PR to work out with the client. But given that a certain level of error is inherent in every publication, every article, and given that, working with the media inherently involves that risk of error, you have to decide for any given error whether it is not just factually wrong, but whether it's important enough to go back to the reporter on. Like there might be a clear error of fact that is just a completely trivial. It says that you graduated college on a certain date and you graduated 2 months later or something like that. Like they would probably change that if you ask, but you sort of have to decide if you're going back to them on a whole bunch of things, how much of your capital you want to use on that request. So typically we will go back once on matters of fact and typically within a couple hours of publication because the reporter will have moved on and they might not even have control over the story at that point. When I was reporting, typically the reporter worked with the source up to the point of publication. And after that, the reporter would just refer everything to the editor. Now, these days, reporters tend to have their hands on the content management system, the CMS, more than they used to in the past. They are more able to make changes. And I don't know that that's been an entirely healthy development because it's created this dynamic where, because they can make changes, it encourages people placing news to feel like they can and should request changes until the story reflects exactly what they want to see. And sometimes the reporter will agree to it, and sometimes they will get very upset about requests like that. And of course, as PRs, one of our highest priorities is the ongoing relationship with the reporter. We understand that this is a long game, and over the long run, a relatively minor error of fact is going to be less significant to your PR program than the health of your relationship with the reporter. So I have seen a client successfully request a change in a published story at a business publication with a reporter who up to that point was very eager to work with that client. And after that change was made, the reporter never even acknowledged contact from that client again. That reporter had to go through several iterations with their editor to get the change made. And it seems it was traumatic enough that reporter just said, never again.
Right. You're done. Yeah. And so it's a value judgment. Often the reporters are not writing the headline or choosing the artwork themselves either. Obviously, you can't change something that you actually said. I know I said this, but I really wish I hadn't. So there's some ability to correct facts. There's not an ability to correct the interpretation, or, hey, they called it a gateway, but we're really a proxy, and I would never. Okay, let's maybe not burn this relationship on that basis and move on. But I think that's an important thing, because on the day with an exclusive, this is the story, and it's been a journey and sometimes quite a roller coaster to kind of get it out. And of course, you want it to be perfect, because you want to then put it in your newsletter and share it over social and, share it around the company. And, you're going to recycle that and amplify that article as much as possible. And I want it to be right. And most of the time they are really great, but sometimes there's a little bit of correction that needs to be made. We were talking earlier about pitching an exclusive, but I'm also interested in whether there's some kind of hybrid here, whether I could pitch pieces of the story, maybe an interview with the CEO, maybe some particular slice of the data, and give that exclusively to one reporter. How does that work?
You absolutely can do that. That is essentially a variant of pitching under embargo. So an embargo doesn't mean that everybody gets the exact same story. It means that whatever is embargoed, everybody gets. Under most circumstances, that will look like the press release or just the core of the news. And then each reporter getting that news ahead of time can decide what elements, if any, they need beyond the press release to write. They can ask the newsmaker for more resources, for interviews. They can go interview people that they have in their own contact list, and then assemble the story as they want. And as part of that, to make the story attractive to multiple reporters, you can sort of carve out certain opportunities. Often those will look like an interview with a key executive or an interview with the venture capitalist involved, and especially if it's a funding news. You could say, you'll be the only one to talk to the VC. You'll be the only one to talk to the CEO. Or you'll be the only one with a video of, this would be less likely, but like a video of our demo. Like, you're the only one with these particular graphics we can give you. Or we have data that we'll only provide to you. That can be an excellent way to combine the best of both forms of pre-pitching, the exclusive and the embargo. It's a lot of work. It requires a lot of support from the client. Typically when you go into a run-of-the-mill announcement, you have press release plus spokesperson, right? To execute the strategy we're talking about here, you need more elements, right? You need more compelling pieces to the story. And if you have all those pieces, it's going to be tempting to just put them all together and go for the exclusive, right? But it is an option, if you have all those elements, to break them up and hand them out to, different reporters and get a more substantial story from each one of those publications than you would have otherwise. And that, in some ways, is the best case scenario. That done right, that is the best of all worlds.
Right. And just to be clear, if we've placed an exclusive and the reporter believes they're the only one getting this story, we can't also then pitch another person who someone on the management team also knows as a friend. They'll write, like, you can't pitch another reporter with the same story. You can, if you're pitching under an embargo, give people exclusive elements to it, but they must be aware that there are other reporters getting this story. Absolutely, an absolute no-no to be, okay, we're under exclusive with this, but I also know this other person who would be interested in writing about it. You've got to resist that.
That's right. And, we've talked about PR horror stories, but any reporter can tell you about horror stories of their own where they feel, probably rightly, that an organization has not been fully upfront with them. The organization tells them they're getting the exclusive, and in fact, the organization is working with another publication. And as you indicated, sometimes it looks cynical or malicious on the organization's part, but it can sometimes happen when a VC or an executive in the company has their own relationship with a reporter and they just go rogue. And sometimes, for entirely well-meaning reasons, they reach out to someone that they know and share the news, and now it's no longer an exclusive, but the PR team doesn't even necessarily know. And sometimes, in my career, I've discovered this has happened a day or so before the news comes out and really had to scramble to figure out how to manage it. Some reporters and some publications are much more wound up about exclusives and timing and whatnot. And I think you generally have to assume that they're going to be. In fact, you would think that the more prestigious what are regarded as the more prestigious, like national publications, would be the most worried about it. And I'm not saying they're not, but you would be amazed at how upset a reporter at a relatively lesser known trade publication can get if they think that you've handed the news to the Wall Street Journal as well. I had that experience, and I hadn't handed the news to the Wall Street Journal, but the Wall Street Journal, because they had previous, we'd worked with them previously, wrote a story around the same time as this story that we had under embargo with a trade publication. And it wasn't even about the news, and the trade publication got wound up. So you do generally, or we always try to play it straight, play it fair. And if we're giving an exclusive, it means nobody else gets the news.
But so if a reporter passes on the story, you're perfectly at your rights to move on and pitch somebody else, and they're sort of not going to write it later on, even if they've got the information, right?
That's a great point. And that is something that we often get asked by clients. You are correct. When you are working with journalists on an exclusive, it's sort of understood that even though it is technically, when a reporter gets news, their core function is to write it as soon as they know it and they can verify it. If they think it's newsworthy, they should be writing it. But in the case of an exclusive, there's a sort of gentle person's agreement that if a reporter passes on the exclusive, they simply aren't going to write it. They're not going to just decide, well, you know what, I have this news, and since I know it, I'm going to come out with it. If they said, no, I don't want it, they won't publish it. So you can treat that as though they were never pitched. There's no conflict between pitching someone under exclusive, getting a no, and pitching someone else under exclusive. If someone accepts an exclusive, they are doing so with the understanding that you are not going to tell anyone else about this news. And then someone will say, like, well, are there exceptions to that? And of course, there's an exception to everything, and it usually hinges on relationships. The short version is, if you're not sure that a reporter would be okay with you giving a heads up to another reporter, with the understanding that that other reporter won't publish until the exclusive reporter publishes, then you just don't generally do it. It's a risk. It would be a calculated risk, and it's one we try to avoid. Different PR professionals will have different views of how to handle this. Some are bigger risk takers. Some are more concerned with having a long-term relationship with every reporter they come across, trying to play fair. And then there are people sort of in the middle. I would say that we lean organizationally more toward being upfront, playing fair, making sure everyone understands the rules, and then we stick to the rules, right? So that there are no surprises. It is interesting. Sometimes reporters will ask for a jump. If they're under embargo, they will ask, hey, could we get 2 hours, a jump on this? And that can be really tempting if it's a publication like Bloomberg, right? Some top tier business publication that you really want is sort of suggesting, well, maybe the difference between covering this and not is if we get a 2-hour jump, but you've already agreed to the embargo with all these other publications. That's a moment, right? You really have to decide how to handle it. And there might be a way to make everybody happy. All the other reports. It may be that those other reporters under embargo don't care. If you know them well enough to basically go back to them and say, like full disclosure, there's going to be a story not with one of your competitors, but a business publication that doesn't even reach that is not primarily for your ears. Like you could conceivably do that, but it's so contrary to established practice and the sort of spirit of an embargo that you're starting from behind in that conversation, and you just try to avoid it if you can.
I mean, look, we're talking about embargoes there, and that used to be when you had multiple reporters under embargo, some publications would accidentally publish early, which if you had a few reps on this, you would get to know it. And some of the reporters would then say, well, if these guys are in it, then we're not. I think that's going down now, I'd like to think. But to the point, if the news does leak, say you're going an exclusive and it leaks, let's say, hey, we're going to go with our funding news with this particular reporter. Now, there's a lot of people who know when a funding transaction takes place. There are attorneys and there are multiple VCs involved. There's a lot of controlling that information, however hard you do it, is difficult. So it can leak. And, there are outlets that are looking for those big funding, particularly if you're a hot company, they want to get the scoop on the funding. So if you are working on an exclusive or even an embargo with multiple reporters and it leaks, the next thing you do is just tell everybody, okay, it's leaked. Just publish when you can, right? If it's an exclusive, that may kill your story.
Yes, I've seen both happen. Thankfully, it's been years since I experienced a bona fide broken embargo. Reuters used to be infamous for breaking embargoes for whatever reason. They would say, "Oh, our CMS, it was a mistake. We entered they entered the wrong time zone." It was like, really? 18 hours? That's a funny mistake to make. And so the controlling rule is inform as soon as you can. Obviously, you're apologetic, but try to find a way forward. What I have seen recently is that reporters are often, as you say, partly because the facts of the news are not as important as the context for the news in a lot of cases for the purposes of an in-depth story like an exclusive. As long as nobody else has those extra materials that make a story more distinctive than a press release, then usually the story will go ahead. I've absolutely in my career seen exclusives killed by companies that leak news intentionally or inadvertently. And it's maddening when that happens. But generally, if you have an exclusive, you're in a much, much better position to rescue the story than you are when you're pitching under embargo. Under embargo, a lot, if the reporter, especially if they had a story queued up to go and someone comes out with it 6 hours early or 12 hours early or something, they'll often just say goodbye to the story. That's especially for publications that are driven by clicks, that are driven by advertising, because the number of clicks that come into a story that is behind the curve, time-wise, are dramatically lower. Or at least they used to be back when that was a more popular business model. Now that more publications are shifting to like a softer hard paywall with subscription, I feel like some of the anxiety has drained out of that issue. It feels like it was the sort of tension and anxiety around embargoes, and the incidence of broken embargoes was highest at the absolute peak of the ad-based business model.
So just as we wrap up here, Chris, are there any final tips that you have when we're thinking about pitching a media exclusive?
I would just go back to time, because, I was thinking recently about strategy and like, what is the essence of strategy? And on some level, it seems to me that it's about shaping time. And with an exclusive, as I said earlier, when it all goes well, it can be a very efficient way to get the coverage of your dreams, right? Exactly the story that you're hoping to get and exactly the publication you're hoping to get it. But to quote another famous military maxim, strategy rarely survives contact with the enemy, or in this case, contact with reality. And, you rattled off earlier a list of seemingly random, unlikely obstacles to an exclusive. Somebody is hosting a conference. Somebody is sick. It might seem like any one of those might crop up during an exclusive pitch, but in my experience, what you described was a typical exclusive pitch process where all 4 or 5 of those things happen. So it sort of underlines the importance of having, before you go into an exclusive pitch, having an overarching media strategy that will help you understand the purpose or what role in your larger strategy any given announcement can play. And that will help you decide early on what steps to take when it comes time to make contact with the media and what approach to take. And if you have made those preparations going in, what publications you want to be in touch with, you know what reporters you want to be in touch with. You're not coming in completely cold with these reporters. You've had touches with them before. It's all the preliminaries that allow you to shape the time of the actual pitch most effectively. And when you're pursuing an exclusive, even though it might seem to be the simplest and in some ways the most rigid of strategies, it's actually often the one that requires the most flexibility. So I would just say, put yourself in a position through preparation to achieve success, because where you are least likely to have an outcome that you want is when you start thinking about all this when the news pops up as an action item.
Yeah, that's right. And this is a high pressure moment, a pinnacle often in the media, overall media campaign. It's a real milestone, but just also sort of step back and understand, look, in the sweep of this organization's relationships with its, reporters and then its broader audiences, this is just one moment. And so just as the preparation leading up to that is really important, it can be a bit of a roller coaster. Think about what comes afterwards and just keep it within that context so that you can go on and build a relationship with other reporters, maybe that you didn't go with on this exclusive, or so you can deepen the relationship with this reporter, so you can go after other publications. So even if the article, it doesn't have all of the messages that you wanted. So I would also just say that understand that the exclusive is a real milestone in a company's media relations experience, and it's a great opportunity to build a really good relationship with a reporter by working with them so they really understand your company. And maybe you can build on that for subsequent stories and just keep that broader arc, right? This is a milestone. What are you going to say next? Just as Chris had said, look, the run up to it helps the success. Think about what comes after. I think this is a great tool in your armory. We've gone through today, what an exclusive is, what kind of stories apply to that, why you might choose it, what are the downsides, Where can the process go wrong based on our experience? How do you set yourself up for success? And then how do you move on past that? And just think about, what does this mean from a reporter's perspective and not just from the startup's point of view? So Chris, thanks for your time today. Really enjoyed that. It was a good chance to kind of dive deep on exclusives, which are a key part of any PR program. I appreciate your time.
It was a great talk. Always good to be here.
Great. Thanks a lot, Chris. We'll talk to you soon.
Great to be here. Thanks so much.
Well, that about wraps it up for today. But before we close, we did want to offer all of our Fired Up friends a chance to grab a mega pack of all of our ebooks and guides. That's our guide to content marketing. That's our startup guide to paid media using Google Ads. It's our guide to attribution. You can get all of those, over 100 pages of goodness, at firebrand.marketing/fired up freebies. That's freebies with an S. And we hope you enjoyed the show. And if you did, please give us a rating wherever you get your podcasts, or drop us a note at firebrand.marketing. And as ever, the details of how to get in touch with our guest today can be found in the show notes. Thank you for listening. And until next week, get out there and crush your marketing goals.